Welcome back. Today we're going to dive into a really important topic. Just a quick review. I know that last class we looked at the bombing and the surprise attack of Pearl Harbor and how that's going to finally get the United States joined into World War II and how that's a pretty big deal because we are forced to stop isolating ourselves and putting ourselves in this little bubble, and now we're in the war. And I know some of you are dying to know, like, what are we going to do next? We're in this war. What are we going to do about it? And we're going to get to that in our next class. But today we're going to look at the topic of the importance of African American soldiers during World War II. So let's look at our I can statement. So by the end of this class, and you're going to go ahead and say this out loud with me, I can explain the importance of African American soldiers during World War II. And I know some of you didn't say that out loud, so let's do it again. I can explain the importance of African American soldiers during World War II. So if by the end of the class you can't explain the importance of African American soldiers, then you know you've got a problem, and that means you need to go back and either rewatch this video, watch the attached video, or do the reading that we've got in here. So you should be able to do that by the end of the class. All right, so let's look at African Americans during World War II. So during World War II, the military services were strictly segregated. And what segregated means is like separated. So the African American troops were separated from the white troops. And this was the norm throughout a lot of the country as well, unfortunately. So it wasn't just in the military, it was just kind of following what a lot of the United States was still doing at the time. But as we're going to see through some of these great men we hear about today, some of that's going to ideas are going to start shifting toward integration. So there were a lot of African American troops in the US military, but not all military roles, that's this word right here, roles were available to them. What that means is there were certain jobs and responsibilities that they weren't able to do because of the color of their skin. This was due to this racist idea that for some reason blacks were considered inferior to whites and other races. So what we're going to see is how some people are going to prove that to be completely wrong. And let's see how we're going to do that. So probably the most famous group that's going to prove that it doesn't matter what color your skin is the Tuskegee Airmen. And that word's kind of hard to say, so you might want to say it out loud. Tuskegee. Tuskegee. And this was a group of airmen, meaning pilots, that made a name for themselves during World War II. So you got to remember, I just said that not all military roles were available to African Americans. They often got some of the worst jobs in the Army and military in general. But being a pilot was like one of the top jobs. So how did that happen? Well, they were trained at this elite institute called the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Still a very, very famous place throughout history, and especially through Black history. But they're going to train there. What the sad part about this is we're talking about segregation. The U.S. Army, U.S. military spent over $1 million to create an institute specifically for Black pilots to train, which sounds great, except they built a whole new place rather than just letting them train with the white pilots, which would have made a lot more sense because we're trying to show equality here. So, but because they were Black, they were segregated from white pilots, like I just said, but they still went through, here's the good part, they still went through the same difficult training program, which I know some of you are like, well, difficult, that doesn't sound good, but it is good because they wanted to be trained to be the best of the best, especially when you're up there doing something dangerous like that. And you can apply that same theory to life in general. I know sometimes maybe school's difficult or whatever, sports, or maybe if you play an instrument, but by going through difficult training, it's what allows you to be the best of the best. And if you don't face some hardships, you're not going to get better. So they wanted the hard training, and it worked for them. And here's a picture of them. And this isn't all of them, obviously. This is just a group of Tuskegee Airmen in front of a P-40, which is one of the famous fighter planes that United States Army Air Force had during World War II. So after their difficult training program, they did gain respect as the war went on. They earned their respect because they proved to be some of the best. And one of the primary jobs that the Tuskegee Airmen had was they were flying escorts to bombers. What that means is they fly beside bombers, the big planes that go above military targets and drop their bombs onto them. And they're going to escort them because what the enemy, the Germans and the Italians, our enemies would do is they get their fighter planes up in the sky to go try to shoot down our bombers. So we would send fighters with our bombers, like the Tuskegee Airmen, who would fight back against the German fighter planes. And they weren't just good, they were spectacular. The Tuskegee Airmen were the only squadron to not lose a single bomber during all of their missions during World War II. And it's not like they just had a couple missions. They flew thousands of missions and did not lose a single bomber. So that's pretty cool. Here's a couple real pictures from World War II. This is them in Italy in 1945 toward the end of the war. Looks like here they're planning a mission. And it looks like here they're probably debriefing after a mission, or they might be planning for a mission. And you can notice behind them here, those of you who are really into this, this looks like a P-51 Mustang, which was probably our most famous and best fighter plane during World War II. So pretty cool stuff. So the Tuskegee Airmen were the most famous by far, but another group of Black soldiers was the 761st Tank Battalion. And this is a pretty cool role too, because remember I said some jobs weren't available, but being on a tank crew was also a pretty high ranking, or not high ranking, but pretty good job to have. People really looked up to the tank crews. It wasn't like a low type job. And they proved to be one of the best as well. And I think you're going to see it in your reading, but they're really famous for the defense of a city. I think it was the city of Cologne that the Germans were trying to take back during one of our last offenses in the war. And they helped lead the defense of that city and helped save a lot of other lives throughout the war. So pretty cool stuff. So one of the major importance of this is it starts to shift some people's ideas about what they thought about race and identity in general. Not everyone, clearly. There's a long way to go. There's still a long way to go today, as I'm sure you know. But in 1948, President Truman, this was years after the war ended, issued an executive order to desegregate the armed forces, meaning that whites and blacks were now going to serve in the same units. They were going to train at the same places. They're going to serve together. And that's a big step toward racial, civil rights equality that we're still always striving for. And it wasn't just these group of young men in the Tuskegee Airmen and the 761st Tank Battalion, but they are two of the most famous who helped lead that charge and prove that it doesn't matter what color your skin is. What matters is what you do with the life that you're given. And that's what they are going to prove. So you're going to have a little reading on this. I got a really great video I'm going to attach about the Tuskegee Airmen, with actually has some of the actual pilots that flew that are going to be talking. So that's pretty cool. And you're going to have a little quiz on all this. Tomorrow, or the next day, we're going to jump into what's called D-Day, which is the next big event in World War II that you need to know about.